I have extreme difficulty with the idea that conflict prevention is caused by fighting. If you want, my experience is that if you want to intervene in someone else's fight, then you've got to win it. And you might find yourself fighting all of them. Now, just be quite clear what you're taking on before you start to talk about conflict prevention as an act of your armed forces. Because you've got to beat the lot, or potentially got to beat the lot, which is what America found once it was in Iraq. You need to enter this with a rather clear-headed view that the something that must be done isn't necessarily the application of armed force. You might well have the military involved, but be quite clear what you're doing in the mix. And preventing other people having a fight is a big handful of an idea in which, by 2020, one brigade of soldiers, and it will always be soldiers to do this, not the Navy, not the Air Force, isn't going to go very far. I speak for the Army now. In a full-blown fight, we have said we will be capable of fielding a brigade for overtime, if I remember that correctly. Well, that covers you in terms of defence of a piece of territory of about the distance between Aldershot and Fleet, which from my memory is about 5 to 6 kilometres. I was merely using that as an example of actually what we've costed and said that by whatever it is, 2020, this is what we're going to be able to sustain. Well, that's not a lot. Why isn't there a principle in there that says we should have 2 of everything, that we're dispersed, that we don't cluster it all around London or wherever? That seems to me to be the sort of thing that we ought to be putting in our national security strategy, that we have dispersion, that we're capable of expanding our organisations back into a defensive role. That is strategic, in my understanding.
And whilst there's much talk of the focus on resilience, clearly you don't think it's there in practice.
Well, if we can barely supply our civil aviation with fuel for 2 years, then we got away with it, perhaps. But that's hardly resilience when it was an accident. We mustn't just bring this straight down to the armed forces. If we're doing this all together on the same line, then you have to understand the whole. It is to do with the capacity to learn, and its intelligence in the broadest sense of the word. Acquisition is not just the secret stuff, it's not just having the right radar, it's the capacity to operate and learn as a whole.
We've asked you what you think of the SDSR. We've asked you what you think of the National Security Council. Haven't asked you what you think of the National Security Strategy.
It states the objectives, you might say 2.5 objectives, if I remember correctly. There's to secure and protect the kingdom. It's not quite clear whether that's the people or the place. And we're to have a safe, secure context in which we live. Those are very general objectives. And then it says that we are to have no diminution, I think it is, of our influence abroad. That I find difficult in the circumstance to understand and achieve that in the circumstances.
I think we share your view.
Following your logic through, it does seem strange that the national security strategy says so little about maritime security. When we're not only an island, but we've also had the recent example of Mumbai, of a land threat coming from the sea.
I would like to see a great deal more concentration on the absolute essential of trade. it says, we require prosperity. Well, prosperity comes from trade.
And it has to come through the ports.
If that logic is there, then, and you want a holistic approach, then we have to consider how we do this and who our trading partners are, and so on and so forth. And this might be how you start to categorise where you do intervene and where you don't. We of all nations sit in the centre of the inhabited world, if you see it in a globe, and are utterly dependent in peace and war on our ability to trade, because we can't feed ourselves and we can't heat ourselves in peace or war unless we trade. We can't stand a siege. The objective has to be rather more concretely stated in the event. Because one of the consequences of our modern circumstances is that we don't know what the threat is. The whole of the construct of the previous 100 years is that we've had a threat. We've been able to say that this is the threat. We don't know what it is anymore.